Right, this is the next chapter in The Quest for the White Merle by Lilian Gask. The fourth chapter, A Wild Goose Chase. Over the sea Conrad sped once more, but now he flew zigzag towards the south. The sharp salt wind blew full in his face, driving Gladheart very close to his neck for warmth. It was a long journey, and he was growing tired when the island of Nova Zembla stretched before him. Seen from the great height at which he was soaring, it looked very long and narrow. Gladheart told him that it was fully 600 miles in length. "No one lives there," he said, "but sometimes Russians or Norwegians come to hunt the walrus or seek rare birds. We will land on the western side where the warm Gulf Stream has melted most of the ice." Conrad alighted on the shelving bank that sloped upward from the sea, first crossing the deep snowdrifts that remained to tell of the winter's storms. As he threw himself wearily under a rock, Gladheart hopped away to look for berries for him, always his first care. Conrad lay so still that a purple sandpiper perched on his toes and remarked that the sun was warming. He was a graceful little bird with very thin legs and a short tail, and reminded Conrad of the common sandpiper that he had often seen at home, digging his long beak into the sand as he sought for the small sea creatures on which he lived.
"The common sandpipers are quite good creatures," said the newcomer, looking at Conrad shyly with bright dark eyes. "The green sandpipers, I regret to say, are just as closely related to me. The shameful way in which they refuse to build nests of their own and take possessions of those belonging to other birds, or even squirrels, makes us all ashamed. There are troubles in every family, I suppose, and we have to make the best of them, like everyone else."
He chattered on, and Conrad was glad to listen, for he was much too tired to talk himself. Before he left him, the little fellow pointed out, swimming about in a pond close by, the dainty red-necked phalaropes, and hinted darkly that their domestic arrangements were very queer. The phalaropes were extremely pretty to look at, and Conrad lay back and watched them as they glided over the water, or skimmed its surface lightly as the petals of some wind-tossed flower. He soon discovered that although the sober-plumaged males, as pointed out to him by the purple sandpipers, seemed wholly intent upon finding food, the gaily decked females were more romantically inclined. One lovely lady was so persistent in her attentions to the bird of her choice that Conrad was unfeeling enough to laugh. Wherever he went, she followed him, arching her slender neck that he might see the rainbow hues that gleamed upon it, and swimming so close that she almost touched him. Meeting with no encouragement, her reluctant swain seemed indeed most anxious to avoid her. She circled round and round him in much distress, now and then rising some 10 or 12 inches above his head and beating her wings against the air until they made a whistling sound. This evidently so touched him that he relented, and now the two birds swam on together, side by side. "Ah," murmured a snowy owl, speaking close to Conrad's ear, "he's done for now, poor thing. She'll make him sit on her eggs for her, turn and turn about, while she flirts over the pond. Those phalaropes never learn wisdom. He's a man. I'm off." A party of sportsmen had landed from a small boat some 200 or 300 yards away. They were tall and fair, and Conrad guessed that they were Norwegians, even before he caught sight of the gay little flag flying from the masthead of the ship, lying amongst the ice floes. Each man carried a gun, and as they separated, Conrad saw with dismay that one was coming in his direction. At that moment he realised the terror which wild creatures feel at the approach of men. "Creep under the ledge of that rock," cried Gladheart, reappearing at the first sign of danger. "He will not notice you then. Your wings are the same soft brown as the lichen that covers it. Hush! Lie very still. He's almost here. Conrad made himself as small as possible, scarcely daring to breathe. The big Norwegian passed quite near his hiding place, looked at a flock of birds that circled close to the shore, and raised his gun to his shoulders. A moment later, an Arctic tern fell, struggling, into the sea. And now Conrad saw what filled him with amazement. Instead of flying off, panic-stricken at the sound of the shot, the terns gathered round their wounded comrade with plaintive cries, showing the greatest concern and sympathy. Two of them flew close beside him, and, each taking one of his wings most carefully in his beak, lifted him between them out of the sea, and on to a floating block of ice. The two other terns soon relieved these, and carried him further still, and then the first two resumed their work of mercy. In this way the wounded bird was actually carried to a rock some distance out to sea. The Norwegian, dropping his gun, had watched them in silence. He picked it up now and turned away. There was such a look in his blue eyes that Conrad knew he would never shoot a tern again. The rock was but a hard resting place, but Conrad was very tired. In less than 5 minutes he was dreaming of the White Merle, and slept soundly until Gladheart awakened him. It was morning, and when he had thankfully eaten the berries the robin had brought him, he preened his wings and rose high in the air with a delightful sense of freedom. He found that Gooseland, as some explorer has named the long green strip, running out to sea, which is the favourite breeding place of the wild, geese and swans that flock to the north when winter is over, was right away over the mountains and far beyond the narrow channel of water that almost divides Nova Zembla in two. Conrad was quite ready to rest again when he neared the other end of the island and caught sight of huge nests surrounding the tiny lakes on the green plains. Here flocks of birds were crowded together almost as closely as the little auks on the Spitzbergen cliffs. As Conrad set foot upon the headland, a splendid swan flew angrily to meet him, the rushing of his wings through the air sounding like the swish of a heavy sea. With a trumpet-like cry, whoop, 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 he fiercely demanded how Conrad dared to trespass on his territory. His voice was so alarming that Gladheart hid himself at once. "I was advised to come by the snowy owl," answered Conrad politely, holding his head very high to show that he was not afraid. "I am looking for the fair White Merle, the notes of whose song can bring sight to the blind. I would harm none of you, for all birds are my friends." The swan's neck took another curve, and his harsh whoop, whoop, was succeeded by a deep, clear whistle. "You would not find it easy to harm a hooper," he said, "and I could stun you with a single blow. As to the White Merle, why trouble yourself about her? She cannot be half as lovely as my mate. Come, you shall see her. Better unfurl your wings again, for if you use those clumsy feet of yours you might disturb our nests. The untidy heaps of rough sticks that you see on the hillocks belong to the geese. They're neighbours of ours, but we don't think much of them. 'Tis a pity they came here first. To tell the truth—" His confidences were interrupted by a perfect babble of sound. "Take her!" cried the swan. "Here's another flock of geese arriving. Keep out of their way if you don't want your eyes pecked out. They're anything but amiable, I can assure you." The geese were flying in single file, and their numbers seemed to Conrad to be unending. As he followed the swan, he decided that his visit to Gooseland was not likely to be of much use to him, and almost wished that he had flown straight on. "May I ask why you are here?" "May I ask what you are?" the hooper said, when the cackling had somewhat subsided. "You don't look like one of the land birds, and your feet are certainly not webbed. Indeed, now I see you closely, you are more like a man than anything else. We meet with men in the southern climes where we pass the winter, and I find it best to keep out of their way, for you can never tell what they may do. Some of them have curious sticks that make thunder and lightning when they point them. Can you tell me what they are?" Conrad avoided this question by exclaiming at the immense size of the swans' nests, which they were then passing. Big, untidy structures made of sticks and rushes and odd-shaped stones that surrounded the little lakes, and were often more than a yard across. Many were raised some 2 or 3 feet above the level of the ground, in order, his guide told him, that they could not be flooded if the lakes overflowed. The beautiful snow-white birds who were already sitting on bronze-green eggs might have been queens from the attentions paid to them by their devoted mates. A curious sight met Conrad's eyes by the next lake they came to. 2 fine young swans were standing face to face, about a yard apart. They gazed at each other rapturously, and then wheeled suddenly round, repeating this movement several times in swift succession. "They are courting," Conrad's friend explained indulgently. "It is rather late in the season, perhaps, for we usually get this over directly we land. But that young swan did not know her own mind. We mate for life, you see, and some of us live for 50 years. Here is my nest and my lady swan. What bird could be more beautiful than she?" The lady swan looked at Conrad calmly, and made no objection when he seated himself on the edge of her nest. "You are winged," she said, "and therefore I do not fear you. But men are terrible creatures. They covet our soft white down to adorn the raiment of the young, and our snowy plumes to decorate their mates. They care not what pain they inflict upon us, if they can gratify their greed and vanity. The night wind says that this is always so." Conrad felt very uncomfortable, but the lady swan was thinking too seriously of the hardship of the birds to notice his confusion, and her mate was looking the other way. "One year," she continued sadly, "we spent a summer in Iceland, and in August, when we had our quill feathers cast and could not fly, a number of Icelanders invaded our breeding ground. They were not satisfied to come by themselves, but they brought great packs of dogs that they had trained to seize us by our necks, so that we were overbalanced and fell without being able to defend ourselves. Many of our flock were caught and killed in this way, but my mate and I, being marvellously fleet of foot, left the dogs behind. I shall never forget that day, or our grief at the loss of our pretty cygnets. They were the sweetest we ever had, and their voices were as soft as the sigh of the wind on a moonlight night." "They were not nearly such fine birds, though, as the 3 you saved from being carried away by a rapid current when we crossed the wide river last autumn," her mate reminded her admiringly. "The cygnets found the stream too much for them," he went on, turning to Conrad. "The mother immediately dived after them and succeeded in getting all of them on her back, thus carrying them to safely to land. We often carry our young this way when they are in danger, and they are such tender morsels that it is no wonder they have so many foes." "Ah," said the lady swan with a deep sigh, "we have reared many broods, and they all leave us. Our children are scattered in many parts of the world by now. For swans, as you doubtless know, are migratory birds. In spring we collect in flocks, as all wild swans do, and leave the lands where we have spent the winter for the Arctic regions where we breed. Thus we see much of life and are great travellers. I am always sorry for the tame swans who stay in one place all their lives. It must be very dull for them." "I think that they are happy enough," Conrad remarked, remembering those he had seen on the river last year, sailing down a peaceful backwater with a little family between them in Quaker grey. One day, when I was watching two baby cygnets sunning themselves on the river bank, a huge carrion crow swooped down upon the plumpest and tried to peck its eyes out. The father bird caught the crow in his strong beak and held it under the water until it was drowned. He picked it up as if it had been a worm. Some swans had gathered round him as he spoke, and they whistled their approval and then hooped. It was a perfect babble, and above it all rose the shrill cackle of the wild geese. One that appeared to be their leader, a bird with a commanding eye and a loud hiss that might have come from a steam engine, flew up to demand whether Conrad intended to insult them, or if it were only through ignorance that he ignored their presence. "This island belongs to us as much as to the swans," he said. "More so indeed, for it is called Gooseland. The lord of the wild geese awaits your pleasure." "Better go at once," whispered Gladheart, snuggling more closely still against his throat. So Conrad reluctantly said farewell to the lady swan, who had quite taken his fancy. He had never seen so many geese together at one time, though he had often watched their rapid flight in autumn and wondered if it were true that, on some of their longer journeys of 600 miles and more, they allowed small birds to perch on their backs, so that they might travel in safety over the sea. He knew some people believed it, but it seemed him very unlikely. As the lord of the wild geese detached himself from the flock, he determined to ask him. "Will you tell me?" he began, but could go on no further. The geese were hissing with one accord, and it was quite impossible to make himself heard. When the hissing ceased, he found that he was expected to answer questions instead of ask them, and spent quite a lively 10 minutes in accounting for his presence. "I think we may consider him harmless," said the lord of the wild geese at last, "though I cannot say I like his looks. I should call him a boy bird myself, but I may be wrong. His beak is too ridiculous for anything." Then Conrad had an inspiration. "We ought to be friends," he said politely, "for my greatest chum, after Barney, is a relation of yours. His name is Greyquills, and he lives near my home in the Long Meadow. I feed him every morning, and he follows me all over the place, though he's quite lame." "And what do his kindred say to this strange intimacy?" asked a big goose gravely. Conrad was obliged to own that they would have nothing to do with him, though whether it was for this reason or some other, he could not say. "He must have been awfully lonely at first, poor thing," he went on compassionately, "but now he has found a friend, an old blind goose who belongs to Farmer Trent. Her relations won't have anything to do with her either, so Greyquills leads her about and sometimes even takes her down to the river for a swim. It's true, honour bright. My father wouldn't believe it at first, but he does now." After this, Conrad was on the best of terms with all the geese, especially the big grey ones, who cackled loudest of all. Many of them had visited the Orkneys the previous winter, and others had actually been to Great Britain and knew the very village near which he lived. It was in talking to one of those that Conrad made a desperate blunder. "There used to be a young goose in that neighbourhood that I remember well," said a fine bird musingly. "She had a pleasing voice and was very, very plump. She seemed to admire me greatly as I flew above her head, but I could not stay, poor thing. I wonder what happened to her." "Perhaps," said Conrad with thoughtless candour, "she was that very big goose we had for dinner on Christmas Day. He said no more, for with one accord the great geese flew at him, hissing with rage. Their angry eyes shot sparks of fire, and their beaks gaped threateningly. They waited only for the signal from their leader that would give them permission to tear the stranger to pieces. But the lord of the geese was choking with rage, and before he could utter a sound, Conrad had shot through them and was lost to sight in a scudding cloud. Thank you.